I never thought I'd be facing a lawsuit for walking on my own property, but that's exactly what happened when I encountered the most entitled HOA board member in existence. Let me tell you about Debbie Wilkerson, the self-appointed queen of Oakridge Elementary School's Parent-Teacher Association, who somehow decided that my land was under her jurisdiction. It all started about 3 months ago when I moved into the neighborhood as a new 4th grade teacher at Oakridge Elementary. I was thrilled to find an affordable house just 2 blocks from the school. The property had a lovely oak tree in the backyard and backed up to a small creek that served as a natural boundary between my land and the school grounds. According to my property deed, my land extended 5 feet past the creek, a fact that would become incredibly important later. During my first PTA meeting, I had the misfortune of meeting Debbie Wilkerson. She was exactly what you'd picture, perfectly highlighted blonde bob with not a hair out of place, designer clothes that were just a touch too formal for a school meeting, and an expression that suggested she just smelled something unpleasant whenever anyone else spoke. "And you must be the new teacher," she said, looking me up and down with thinly veiled disapproval. "I hope you understand that we maintain very high standards at Oakridge. My husband and I have donated substantial amounts to ensure this school remains exceptional." I smiled politely. "Nice to meet you, too. I'm looking forward to contributing to the community." Debbie nodded dismissively before turning to greet the principal with an entirely different demeanor, all smiles and enthusiastic hand gestures. I didn't think much of the interaction at the time, but it was just the beginning of our troubled relationship. 2 weeks later, I was setting up a small garden in my backyard when I noticed Debbie standing at the edge of my property, hands on her hips, staring at me. My house was the last one on the street before the school, and apparently, Debbie had been walking the school grounds when she spotted me. "Excuse me," she called out in that tone that immediately makes your skin crawl. "You're violating the landscaping ordinances." I stood up, brushing dirt from my knees. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your garden," she said, gesturing dismissively at my modest vegetable plot. "It's not approved by the HOA. All landscape changes need to be submitted in writing and approved before implementation." I took a deep breath. "Actually, Debbie, I checked before I started. My property isn't part of an HOA. This neighborhood doesn't have one." Her face tightened like she'd just bitten into a lemon. "That's ridiculous. Of course, there's an HOA. I'm the president." "I think you're confusing the PTA with an HOA," I explained gently. "They're different organizations. The PTA involves the school, while an HOA would govern the neighborhood properties. And again, this neighborhood doesn't have one." Debbie's face flushed an alarming shade of red. "I know what a PTA is. I've been president for 5 years. But I also head the Neighborhood Enhancement Committee, which functions as our HOA." "A committee isn't legally binding like an HOA," I said, trying to keep my tone conversational rather than confrontational. "I appreciate your concern, but I've already checked with the county, and I'm well within my rights to plant this garden." She pulled out her phone. "We'll see about that. I'm documenting this violation." And with that, she began taking photos of my garden, my backyard, and even my house. I stood there dumbfounded by the audacity as she marched away, furiously typing on her phone. The next day, I found a printed notice taped to my front door: "Violation, unauthorized landscape modifications. Fine $150 due within 7 days to Oakridge Neighborhood Enhancement Committee." I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. The official notice was clearly made in Microsoft Word with clip art of a gavel at the top. I took it down and decided to ignore it, hoping Debbie would eventually realize she didn't have any actual authority over my property. I was wrong. 3 days later, I found another notice, this one threatening additional fines for non-compliance. The day after that, Debbie was back in my yard when I returned home from school. "You're ignoring the violation notices," she said, blocking my path to my own front door. "Debbie, I'm not ignoring them. I'm rightfully dismissing them because you don't have the authority to issue fines or dictate what I do on my property. There is no legal HOA here. The Enhancement Committee has been operating for 15 years, she insisted. "Just because you're new doesn't mean you can ignore our established rules. Is the committee registered with the county? Is it written into property deeds? Are there legally binding covenants that owners sign when purchasing property here?" I asked, knowing full well the answers were all no. Debbie's mouth opened and closed several times before she finally spoke. "We operate on good faith and community standards. Your garden is an eyesore. It's a vegetable garden, Debbie. I'm growing tomatoes and zucchini, not creating a junkyard. Now, please, I've had a long day teaching your community's children, and I'd like to enter my home." She stepped aside, but not before saying, "This isn't over. The committee will be discussing your case at our next meeting." I didn't hear from Debbie for almost 2 weeks after that, and I thought perhaps she'd finally accepted reality. Then came the incident that would lead to the infamous lawsuit. It was a Saturday morning, and I was cleaning up some fallen branches near the creek at the back of my property. The previous night's storm had been particularly strong, and several branches from my oak tree had fallen, some landing in the creek itself. Being an environmentally conscious person, I didn't want to leave debris that might cause problems downstream. As I was carefully wading in the shallow water to retrieve a particularly large branch, I heard the now familiar sound of Debbie's voice. "You're trespassing on school property," she shouted from the other side of the creek. I looked up to see Debbie in what appeared to be her weekend uniform, designer athleisure wear and oversized sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly coiffed hair. "Good morning, Debbie," I said calmly. "I'm just cleaning up some fallen branches from my tree, and according to my property deed, my land actually extends about 5 feet past this creek." "That's impossible," she scoffed. "The creek is the natural boundary. Everything beyond it belongs to the school and, by extension, falls under my purview as PTA president." "That's not how property lines work," I explained, continuing to remove branches from the water. "They're determined by surveys and legal descriptions, not just natural features. I have the documentation if you'd like to see it." "Stop what you're doing immediately," she demanded. "I'm calling the police." I shrugged and continued working. "Go ahead. I'm not doing anything wrong." To my astonishment, she actually did call the police. I could hear her dramatically explaining to the 911 operator that someone was trespassing on school grounds and potentially damaging a protected waterway. The exaggeration was impressive. 20 minutes later, a police car pulled up to the school parking lot. I watched as Debbie rushed over to the officer, gesturing wildly toward me. The officer, a middle-aged man with a patient expression that suggested he dealt with these types of calls regularly, nodded and made his way over. "Good morning, officer," I called out as he approached. "I'm just cleaning up some storm debris from my property." "She's trespassing," Debbie insisted. "This is school property, and she doesn't have permission to be here, especially not disrupting the creek ecosystem." The officer looked between us. "Ma'am, do you have proof that this is your property?" he asked me. "Yes, officer. My property deed clearly states that my land extends 5 feet beyond the creek. I'd be happy to show you the documentation, it's in my house." "And you, ma'am?" He turned to Debbie. "What's your position at the school?" "I'm the PTA president," she said proudly. "I oversee all matters concerning school grounds and community standards." The officer's expression didn't change, but I swore I saw a small twitch at the corner of his mouth. A PTA president doesn't have authority over property disputes or trespassing matters. That would be between the property owner and the school district. "But I represent the school's interests," Debbie insisted. "Are you employed by the school district?" the officer asked. "No, but—" "Then you don't officially represent the school in legal matters," he said firmly. "Now, let's see that property deed. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much." I retrieved my documentation, and the officer reviewed it carefully. Debbie stood by, arms crossed, foot tapping impatiently on the ground. "Everything appears to be in order," the officer finally said. "According to this, the property line does indeed extend beyond the creek. She's not trespassing." Debbie's face contorted with disbelief. "That can't be right. The school has always maintained that land." "Maintaining it doesn't make it theirs," the officer explained patiently. "Property lines are legally established and recorded with the county." "This is outrageous," Debbie sputtered. "I'll be contacting the school board about this immediately." The officer handed me back my documents. "You're within your rights to continue your work, ma'am. Sorry for the inconvenience." As the officer walked away, Debbie glared at me with such intensity that I half expected to burst into flames. "This isn't over," she hissed before storming off toward the school building. I thought that would be the end of it. After all, a police officer had confirmed I wasn't trespassing. But Debbie Wilkerson was not one to accept defeat gracefully. 3 days later, I was served with papers. Debbie was suing me for trespassing, property damage to the school grounds, and willful disruption of a protected natural habitat. I couldn't believe it. The lawsuit claimed I had damaged school property by removing natural features, potentially disrupted wildlife, and repeatedly ignored warnings to stay off school grounds. What made it even more absurd was that Debbie had filed the lawsuit personally, not through the school district. She was suing me as a private citizen, claiming damages to property she didn't own. I immediately contacted a lawyer, who assured me the case was ridiculous and would likely be thrown out. However, I'd still need to respond formally and potentially attend a hearing, which meant legal fees and time away from teaching. The next PTA meeting was, unsurprisingly, incredibly awkward. Several parents approached me privately to express their support and share their own Debbie stories. Apparently, I wasn't the first person in the neighborhood to face her wrath, just the first to stand my ground firmly enough to provoke a lawsuit. The principal, Dr. Martinez, called me into her office the following day. I was worried that the lawsuit might affect my position at the school, but her concerns were quite different. "I've been made aware of the situation with Mrs. Wilkerson," she said once I was seated. "I want you to know that the school district is not involved in her lawsuit. In fact, our legal team is quite concerned about her claiming to represent the school's interests without authorization." "I figured as much," I replied, relieved. I'm sorry this has created any complications for the school. Dr. Martinez shook her head. You have nothing to apologize for. Mrs. Wilkerson has overstepped her boundaries numerous times in the past. The district has decided it's time to address the situation. She explained that the school board would be reviewing Debbie's position as PTA president, as well as issuing a formal statement clarifying that she did not speak for the school in legal matters. Furthermore, they would be conducting an official survey of the property line between my land and the school grounds. The property survey was completed within a week, and, unsurprisingly, it confirmed exactly what my deed stated. My property extended 5 feet beyond the creek. The school district's lawyer contacted me to apologize for the confusion and assured me that they would not support Debbie's lawsuit in any way. 2 weeks later, I found myself in a courtroom, watching as Debbie confidently marched in with an expensive-looking lawyer at her side. She wore a formal business suit as if she were arguing a case before the Supreme Court rather than a minor property dispute in a local courthouse. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, listened patiently as Debbie's lawyer presented their case, claiming I had repeatedly trespassed on school property despite warnings, damaged protected natural features, and displayed flagrant disregard for community standards. When it was my turn, my lawyer simply presented my property deed, the results of the recent survey conducted by the school district, and a letter from the district stating that Debbie did not represent them in this or any legal matter. The judge took approximately 3 minutes to review the documents before looking up at Debbie with an expression that can only be described as barely contained irritation. Mrs. Wilkerson, the judge said, am I to understand that you have filed a lawsuit claiming damages to property that you do not own, representing an organization that has explicitly stated you do not speak for them legally? Debbie shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, as PTA president, it's my duty to protect school interests. The school district doesn't always have the resources to pursue these matters. That is not your determination to make, the judge replied firmly. The law is quite clear on property boundaries, and it's. The judge dismissed the case immediately and, to my surprise, ordered Debbie to pay my legal fees, stating that the lawsuit was frivolous and without merit. But the real bombshell came as we were leaving the courtroom. Dr. Martinez was waiting outside and approached Debbie with an envelope. Mrs. Wilkerson, the school board met last night and voted unanimously to remove you as PTA president, effective immediately. This letter outlines the reasons, which include misrepresentation of authority and using your position for personal vendettas. Your actions have exposed the district to potential liability and damaged community relations. Debbie's face cycled through a remarkable range of expressions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally, something resembling fear. Her perfectly maintained facade cracked completely as she realized the consequences of her actions. Not only had she lost the lawsuit and been ordered to pay my legal fees, over $3,000, but she'd also lost the position of authority she'd clearly coveted and abused for years. You can't do this, she whispered, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. I've dedicated years to this school. I've raised thousands of dollars. My reputation in this community. Precisely why the board felt immediate action was necessary, Dr. Martinez finished for her. The decision is final, Karen. As Debbie stood there clutching the envelope with trembling hands, I couldn't help but feel a small twinge of sympathy beneath my satisfaction. Her entire identity had been wrapped up in that position of power, and now it was gone, all because she couldn't accept that a small piece of land behind my house wasn't hers to control.